Hello third year historians and welcome to lesson 5 from our Mafia topic. This one is looking at a particular case study of a famous Mafia boss. So we're looking at from Sicily to Italian American Mafia boss and the life of this particular person. So 3 success criteria points for you. You have explored this person's life in a little bit more detail. You can explain the Mafia Hierarchy. We have mentioned this, but we'll just come back to it again. And you have an understanding of what Prohibition actually is and why that's important, and we will talk about that again later on. So wherever your notes or things are, wherever you're doing this, can you please put the heading that we have there, from Sicily to Italian American Mafia boss, and we'll look at the next task. So this is the man in particular that we are looking at, Salvatore Luciano, aka Charles Lucky Luciano. Nobody is actually quite sure why his name changed from Luciana to Luciano. It was thought to have been maybe a mistake when he was first registering in America, and it just kind of stuck. There's been different stories as well, that he had changed it to hide from gangsters in his youth so that they wouldn't be able to find him. The reason that we're not actually sure exactly why is because the records on this are not particularly clear, but it's very likely that it's possibly been when he's registered in America. If you remember from the last lesson, looking at the clip from The Godfather where you saw the young boy coming in, that's kind of what happened with him. He couldn't obviously speak English at that point in time, and they just gave the name when he was registering in America, and that stuck later on from his records and from his paper. So this is him here after being caught in June 1936, and this is his mugshot, as it were, and we're going to look a wee bit more at him in more detail. So basically what you're going to need for this is the fact file that goes along with this lesson. You'll find it in the team with this lesson, and you're just going to use the slides as we go to fill in as much information as you can into the worksheet. You can type on it, or if you want to just write it out as headings and write it, that's absolutely fine. If you download it as a Word document, you'll be able to edit it as you go through and things as well. Just make sure you're stopping the video as you're going and find all the information. It might be in different orders, and there's more information in the slides than you obviously need, so just make sure that any information that you're looking for, you go back and look for it, or you just pause it when you think you found something. So as we said, he was born Salvatore Luciano on the 24th of 11, so November 1897. He was from Sicily, and from one particular region here that was one of the volcanic regions. You can see that happening there above the houses. One interesting point about this, because it was a volcanic region, it was a sulphur mining town, and Luciano's dad was actually one of the miners that worked in these sulphur mines. Now, these sulphur mines were considered to be one of the worst places on the planet to actually have to work, but specifically within Italy, it was one of the most horrendous jobs that anybody had actually seen or heard of. In particular, this man, Booker T. Washington, he was born a slave in America in 1856 and had been freed by the Emancipation Act. He went to Europe in 1910 to find basically the poorest people in society, to compare what their struggles were like to the lives of Black American people, to build a case for that. And he visited Sicily, he visited this town in particular, and he talks about the conditions within these sulphur mines and the treatment of the Sicilians being sort of working there and living there, and he calls it worse than any Black American had ever experienced, even during what he saw as the brutality of slavery. So what he actually said was, "I'm not prepared just now to say to what extent I believe in a physical hell in the next world, but a sulphur mine in Sicily is about the nearest thing to hell that I expect to see in this life." So really, really powerful commentary from him about what he kind of saw when he went into these mines. So as you can imagine, these mines are not particularly a nice place to be. The sulphur mines in general were not, again, very nice. The conditions in them were not really very good. It was very hard work, very, very long hours, having to use hand tools basically to pick away at the sulphur, so it was all done by hand. The lighting was really very poor, which often led to accidents happening and also to problems with eye conditions and things like that developing because of that. It was really bad for your health in general. There could be death due to accidents, it could be death due to the collapse of the mines. It could also result in problems with breathing and things like that as well. It could result in a lot of different sort of issues with clogging of arteries and things, which obviously is not very good. When you were actually in there, there was very little ventilation and it could get up to 50 degrees Celsius. So the workers were basically breathing in toxic fumes, and often what happened was because they were so hot, they actually took their clothes off and they worked naked because it was too hot for them to actually stand any sort of materials or clothing on them. And as you can imagine, this meant that they were more vulnerable to being injured or to accidents happening because there was no protection on their bodies. They had to carry really heavy loads of sulphur on their backs for quite long distances out of the mines. There was no sort of train system or anything to carry stuff out. They had to do it all by hand, and this quite often gave them a lopsided kind of backbone or malformed knees. They ended up getting nicknamed, the town in particular, as the town of hunchbacks by neighbouring sort of towns and people due to the state that many of these men and women working in these mines were ending up in their later years as a result of the workers being there. So not particularly nice place to be. It wasn't just older men and women that worked in the mines either. There were children that were working in them. They could be working in there from 6 years old originally, in sort of before 1876. After 1876 you had to be 10 or over, and then in 1905 you had to be 14 or over. If you think about how this would have actually affected the lives of these young children, it would have resulted in quite significant medical issues. It would have resulted in them not having much of an education because they'd been working in the mines since they were very young, so they hadn't learned to read or write. Not particularly nice as well. A lot of them would be dead because of the medical problems that they'd developed in the mines before they were in their late sort of 40s. And again, they wouldn't be able to really do anything other than that because that's the only job they had ever known. So at this point in time, Luciano, his mum and dad, Antonio and Rosalia, basically didn't want that life for their children. With very little other prospects and the fact that his dad worked in the mines, they knew that that was very likely where their children were going to end up as well. So his dad saved all of the money he could in a jar that he left under his bed, basically keeping it there. That was his personal bank, dreaming to go to America and look for this American dream and start a new life. Eventually he raised enough money for him and his family to be able to leave, and on roughly about April 1907 they left Sicily heading for America in one of the steam powered ships. So when Luciano obviously got to America, one of the first things that his parents did was enrol him in school, because that was one of the major things that they wanted, was for their children to get a good education. And he really hated it. He really didn't enjoy school at all. He really struggled, especially with English and things like reading and writing in English, because it wasn't something that he knew. Didn't understand the work he was being given, so just basically didn't do it, which was a major problem. He left school at 14 against his parents' wishes, and he got a job as a street vendor selling hats, which roughly made him about $7 a week, which wasn't brilliant pay, but wasn't actually too bad at that point in time. However, a lot of the documentaries and things like that and documents that we have at this time said that he had already actually started his life of crime. At this point in time, he was mugging, shoplifting, he was known to be selling drugs and taking part in something called racketeering. So basically what racketeering is you offer the chance to pay for protection even if you don't need it, If you pay, you're going to be protected from anybody. If you refuse to pay, then the person who offers you the protection will basically make sure that you are beaten up or badly injured. So therefore you pay the protection money to stop this happening again. This would happen at higher levels with people with businesses. If they didn't pay protection money, the mafia would have their shop damaged or their business damaged until they did pay. So racketeering was something he got involved with by offering to protect Jewish children from Italian and Irish gangs in New York. He would protect them from being beaten up. If you don't pay, basically you get knocked out, so you pay to get this protection. So racketeering was one of the very first things that he was involved in. And by the time he was actually 15, he already had a criminal record in the US for racketeering and for violence and for mugging and things like that. So he was well on his way to a life of crime, even as a young man, a teenage boy at that point in time. So he then set up his own gang, which didn't last very long before he joined something called the 5 Points Gang. It was most notorious in the area of New York, where a lot of gangs kind of fought for control, and this is where he starts to learn what we would refer to as organised crime and how this is going to work. So this is the map of the 5 Points neighbourhoods. These are the points where they actually work. This is kind of like their area of control. And we can kind of see the poverty and the kind of situation that we can find in the 5 Points area here. So a lot of people in the streets, a lot of quite wealthy people just walking past and things as well. So a lot of opportunity for pickpockets and thieves and stuff in this bit. And again, you can see the same picture. So Luciano eventually starts to grow quite a strong reputation in the criminal world. By 1920, he's been hired as a gunman for one of the Sicilian-born mafia men at this point in time, Joe Massari, who basically becomes one of the most powerful mafia bosses in America. This is him down here, and he's going to become really, really powerful later on. He then worked for Luciano, that is, worked for a Jewish gangster, Arnold Rothstein, which is this person here, up until 1928, and he was making millions and millions of dollars from the criminal activities which Rothstein helped him set up. And then he returned to work for Massari in 1928, briefly worked with another Sicilian-born mafia man, which is the last one on the corner here, in 1931. He was a very powerful mafia boss, and those two were actually the very biggest rivals that existed at that point in time. So criminal activities that Luciano was involved with these particular men, probably the first and most obvious one was illegal gambling. So gambling was illegal between 1910 and 1931 across all of America because it was viewed as the cause of most of America's problems in society, in particular anything to do with poverty and crime. The story goes that he was involved in these illegal gambling rings, but he himself was actually a very lucky gambler, and he got the nickname Lucky because he was so successful at gambling. That's one of the theories that we have. We don't actually know what the real reason for this is, because every time he was asked, he changed the story. Sometimes he said it was just mispronunciation of his name, sometimes he went with the illegal gambling thing, sometimes he argued it was because he had survived an attack by a brutal gang who had left him for dead and he was lucky as a result of that. But every time the story changed, so we don't really know what the real reason for his nickname was. But the most common story was it was because he was really lucky with cards and with dice, and that was two of the main areas he was involved in with the illegal gambling. One of the other things in particular that helped speed Luciano onto his role as mass mafia boss was actually this thing here that you can see happening. What these men are doing is they are pouring alcohol into the sewer system, and they're being watched by members of the government and the police for doing it. This was called Prohibition. Basically, very simply put, Prohibition in America basically made the production, importation, transportation and sale of alcohol completely illegal from 1920 to 1933. So this meant anything alcoholic couldn't be brought into America, couldn't be bought, couldn't be sold. You weren't allowed to have it. This is because Christian groups at the time believed that, like gambling, alcohol was the next big evil to blame for a lot of America's problems, like alcoholism itself, crime and family violence. So they wanted alcohol prohibited, hence prohibition. Many mafia members actually made a lot of money through illegally distributing this alcohol during this time and then using violence and bribes to carry out their businesses and using the alcohol as a main way of gaining money. So basically at this point, Luciano used prohibition quite effectively. He made about £12 million per year from crime, a lot of it to do with the gambling and sale of alcohol during prohibition. 8 million of that were spent on expensive. So expenses basically means giving the boss a cut of the money for the crimes, paying the lawyers and the accountants to deal with any issues or to deal with a large amount of money and launder it, and then to bribe police and politicians. So he made 12 million and he used 8 million of that on his expenses. So roughly that's about $4 million in profit, which today would be roughly about £48 million in profit, roughly. So he is making still a lot of money, even though it looks like he's spending quite a lot of it on these expenses. So these three men definitely helped launch Luciano into the criminal sphere. All this money he was making is because these men helped him become pretty much one of the most successful and feared mafia members at this point in time. However, by the end of 1931, all three of them would be dead. Luciano was responsible for the death of 2 of them. And you can see images from their deaths that were reported in the media actually there. The reason for this is that Luciano realised that prohibition would not last forever, so this opportunity that they were able to make so much money from would not be completely timeless, it would run out. So he had to find new ways of making money. He also wanted to end the Mafia Wars that had been going on, particularly between the 2 Sicilian bosses that he worked with, and they had resulted in roughly about the death of 1,000 people during the Prohibition period. So he knew that they had to end because it was costing too much in life and also too much in expenses to actually control. So Luciano had a vision of managing to get the mafia families and people to actually coexist together. However, he couldn't put this into place because there were a lot of mafia bosses above him that didn't share his ideas. So in order for Luciano to actually get his ideas put forward and to actually almost concrete himself in, cement himself in as the massive boss, the most important one, he had to eliminate some people in order for this progress to actually be made. So Rothstein found himself shot and mortally wounded during a business meeting in a New York hotel in November 1928. Masseria was having a meeting at a New York restaurant when he was unfortunately shot and killed in April 1931. And Marzano was stabbed and then shot in his New York office again in 1931, but in September. Out of the 3 of these, take a guess which ones Luciano actually was responsible for. Those 2. So Arnold Rothstein had been a gangster, a Jewish gangster, but was not officially part of the mafia. The other 2 Sicilian mafia men actually were, and therefore those are the ones that he actually targeted. Luciano asked Masseria to meet him at a restaurant, basically to discuss business, and excused himself to go to the toilet. During that point in time, 4 of his men stepped in and shot Masseria dead. That was the first kill. The main reason for this, why he did it, so the reason for this was the Mafia Wars. Quite simply, the two Sicilian men had been at kind of war with one another for a long period of time, and the reality was that it was becoming more difficult to actually keep any sort of money without having to outlay for expenses. It was becoming too expensive in human life and cost. So Luciano had this idea that the Mafia Wars would have to end. However, he didn't think Massaria actually could win. So instead, he went to Marzano and he offered to kill Massaria in exchange for more power within New York. Marzano agreed. If he killed Massaria, he could then have that territory, and it gave him more power, but it also effectively ended the conflict in Marzano's favour. After he actually did it, Marzano then took New York's territories and split them between 5 mafia families, Sicilian mafia families. The idea was that these families would control different territories and crime within those particular territories, and it would hope that this would stop further wars within New York from happening in future. The very first 5 families of New York are then listed here. So there's Marzano, of course, and then obviously Luciano's family, there's the Pronfani family, and then others as well at the bottom, and these make up our 5 kind of main families at this point in time. Today, 2021, these families actually still exist. All 5 have descendants that are still there, but quite often you'll find them under different names and definitely no longer in control of those territories within New York. Or at least maybe not. So this leads us back to the Mafia Hierarchy. It was generally thought that by creating these 5 families within territories, that Marzano could actually help to control the territories in general, but also his control over them. And this is where the hierarchy kind of came in. He thought it would be more efficient, it would make communication easier between the different families and lessen disputes in general if they took the Mafia Hierarchy, where you have your boss, your underboss, and then you've got your kind of soldiers and your associates and things like that, and he applied the same hierarchy to the families. He modelled it very much on Julius Caesar's military code of command that had existed in ancient Rome. Basically what he did was he made himself bosses of all bosses. However, 4 months after this, Marzano himself was murdered. Gangsters dressed as government agents stabbed him and then shot him 3 times at point blank range while he was working in his office in New York. They had been sent in by Luciano. The reason for this was fairly simple. Although the families were supposed to be equal, Marzano named himself boss of all bosses, and he took large chunks of the criminal activities. So basically, any money and things like that were not split fairly. He demanded a kind of payoff as the boss of all bosses from each families. They had to pay tribute to him. And they were not particularly happy about this because that hadn't been the original agreement. Marzano knew that Luciano was both ambitious and was quite angry with him at this boss of all bosses thing. So he hired an Irish hitman, a man called Vincent Mad Dog Cole, to kill Luciano for the quite handsome price of $25,000, which is roughly about $300,000 in today's money. Basically, Marzano told Luciano to come to his office on the 10th of September, but Luciano had been told and decided that he was going to strike first. So knowing that he was likely to be killed, he instead sent the Jewish gangsters that he had known from his time with the other Jewish gangsters earlier than that to the meeting time. Vincent Cole arrived at Marzano's office half an hour after he had obviously been killed, and instead of actually surrendering the money, he just kept it and didn't bother to target Luciano after that. 5 months after that, he was actually murdered by gangsters as well, who were tired of him. So the day that Marzano died was the day that Luciano should have been killed as well. He turned the tables on him instead. With Massari and Marzano gone, Luciano then tried to put his mafia vision into place. He brought together the most powerful families in all of America. The original 5 from New York City, 1 from Buffalo, and 1 from Chicago. And you can see them here. And with them, he formed something that was known as the Mafia Commission in 1931. This is him at one of the early commission meetings. You can see some of the other members in the background. The commission worked as he originally planned it. They would talk about things together. Everybody was equal, everybody got a fair share, and mafia deaths generally dropped as the Mafia Wars no longer became the main kind of thing that these people were doing. As a result of this, they were sharing the resources, communicating better, making business opportunities for one another rather than putting each other down, and it made much more money for everybody involved at this point in time. Pretty much overnight, Luciano became like a celebrity in New York. He was one of the richest people in the world at one point, and he really did enjoy the attention and showing off his wealth. However, changes were happening in the legal system within America, and because of his celebrity status, it brought quite a lot of attention from the law in America at this point in time, how he'd gotten his money and the things that he actually did in his activities. Lawyers and prosecutors Thomas Dewey and Eunice Carter, as you can see there, they were 2 of the people who really worked with the government to try and stop the mafia's growth and the influence that they seem to have over New York in particular. So they sent in these new prosecutors and police officers who couldn't be bribed. They were not bribable. They had been told by the government, they were closely monitored and watched by internal affairs, and the mafia were basically told that they couldn't be bribed and that they would not ignore the activities that they'd been up to. These 2 people, Dewey and Carter, were very, very instrumental in bringing together a successful case against Luciano and supplying the evidence to eventually prosecute him for his crimes as a member of the mafia. This is him at his trial. So in 1936 he was found guilty of extortion, which was taking money by intimidation, and compulsory prostitution, which was forcing women to obviously work in that field, and he was sentenced to 30 to 50 years in prison. They did not know that he was the head of a mafia family at the time, or that he was chairman of the commission, or he was responsible for many other crimes and the deaths all over New York. The only evidence that they actually had were these particular things that he was tried for. That is because the mafia organisation was very good at covering its tracks, and it was very secretive in everything that he did. That meant that from prison he still continued to control his mafia family before eventually he handed over the control of it to his underboss to maintain its strength when he could no longer communicate with them effectively. But this was still a couple of years into his sentence while he was in prison that he did this. However, he was released from prison in 1946. He used his Sicilian contacts after being asked for his help by the US government to help basically the Americans gain safe entry into Sicily and to take over the island during the Second World War. The Sicilian people really welcomed the mafia and that involvement, as Mussolini had been trying to clamp down on their activities and they wanted him gone. So when Luciano offered them assistance on the exchange of Americans getting brought in, they were happy to do that. Eventually, because of these war efforts, he was released and he was allowed to return to Italy. From Italy, he continued to be part of the mafia operations in America and obviously started new ones in Italy and Sicily as a grown man returning home to the country he was born in. Eventually, he died of a heart attack in Naples airport, 26th of January 1962. He'd gone there to meet an American film producer to discuss making a film about his life. There's a lot of documentaries and things, but not actually many films. And he was 64 years old at the time, so it was natural causes that happened to him. So that's the life of Luciano. There's a lot of good biography clips and things on YouTube that you could check out. Go back through the video and pause it, fill in the worksheet, and submit your completed worksheet as your assignment. Any questions or anything that you're not sure about, put a message in the team or ask your teacher for help.